Welcome back, Art History 2 students. I hope you are doing fantastically well. Today we are actually going to talk about postmodern art, sometimes called contemporary art once we get past 1980. When we look at postmodern art, we really start to date somewhere around 1960, but in different books you might see it as late as 1970 or even 1980 if they combine postmodern and contemporary together. Basically what we're going to be looking at then is the idea of taking the modern aesthetics, the modern art aesthetics. Remember, that simplification of line, form, color, shape, texture, trying to make art with using the basic foundational elements of art, but being very reflective about that rather than trying to create otherworldly experiences. They're going to add that with a history of art styles. And so as you'll see over here, as we'll get in a moment, you could put neo almost in front of any art history style and add that with modern aesthetics, and that's a postmodern aesthetics. So you could have neo-Renaissance or neo-expressionism, neo-impressionism, neo-surrealism. And the other thing is that because modern art had eliminated the powerful messaging that art had been about making people better individuals, raising power dynamics, seeking truth to power, powerful messages are going to be a part of the postmodern art movement. So we're going to have modern art aesthetics, that line, color, form, shape, and texture. We're going to actually be self-reflective and include many other styles and many other art historical reference that shows up. And we're going to use this to show a powerful message. All of this becomes postmodern art. And when we look at, we have one other thing that we're going to add over here. You'll see we have the neo plus the enter-historic art style here, or the modern art aesthetics plus power. That comes from over there. The other thing that's going to begin is the powerful messaging of the issues of people who have been marginalized. The vast majority of art history, as we've talked about, has been written by people who look like me, white, heterosexual, male, fairly wealthy Christians. So it is going to be an art movement where women, because we have had the feminist movement that actually has really started putting up feminist art for the first time in history. We are going to start looking at art of African Americans. And all of this is a direct response to Judy Chicago's wonderful artwork from here, really from the time period of the postmodern. We will talk about this. We'll have a separate section for postmodern art and feminism and where we are today. So we're going to have issues of the marginalized, whether that be disenfranchised because of poverty, whether that because of race, class, gender, sexual orientation. These individuals are all going to have an idea of the show and come to the show and come to the art exhibits. And so it's a very exciting time to be in the arts all the way up until today. The challenge we have with postmodern art is that there are some scholars who say postmodern art has now ended and we are actually moving into a new phase, kind of the post-postmodern art. And that's still yet to be determined. But note, that is something that's out there, at least in the last 5 to 6 years, we are moving into a new semblance. And my highest recommendation for all of you then, because you're currently taking just art history 2, kind of the introductory level where we give an overview, most of you will need to take 2 more art history classes at some point in your future. And the 2 I would most highly recommend, unless you need to take more, one is going to be take a contemporary art class. You need to know who your competition is, what's out there, what other people are doing, what new ideas are being spurned on by others from before. So absolutely take a contemporary art class, generally focusing from 1980 to the present, because we have more than 50 art movements around the planet right now. So you should have an idea of what's going on a global scale, because we do live in a globalized world. My second highest recommendation is to take a non-Western art survey course. Some of you, this will be your required that will make you take. But basically it says what's going on in the non-white world throughout time, where you get to look at China, Africa, Asia, Polynesia, Native Americans, Buddhist art. And so basically the marginalized individuals that were not basically white. Think about it, from the Art History 1, we basically defined art coming out of the Greco-Roman period as those individuals that were Christian and white and where they sent out the artwork in terms of the colonial powers. So it's really been art dominated by white heterosexual male Christians. In a non-Western art course, you look at all the other arts that happen to be out there. Now, they are basically united in the fact that they are non-white heterosexual male Christians. So they have radically different backgrounds. And what makes this class or that class particularly exciting, one of my favorite classes to teach, is that you cover more than 70% of the world's population. Whereas in Art History 1 and Art History 2, we are covering really a limited amount of the world's population. And finally, we're going to use the body, our own bodies, for different elements of art. We're going to try to engage the community for the issues of the marginalized. We're going to start creating environmental art with kind of global awareness of what pollution, global climate change actually has to do. Now, we've seen many of these artists already, so I'll do a review of some of them. But when we are curating a contemporary art museum, one of the challenges of curating a contemporary art museum is the fact you are basically banking that your curators that you've hired are going to be able to see who's going to be influential in the future and why those individuals are going to be influential in the future. And so one of the challenges I'll put to you at the very end is, which five of these postmodern artists do you believe will have the most significant impact on the future development of visual arts? Now, you will note as we walk through, we've seen three-quarters of these already, and I'll walk through a couple more in a moment. Marina Abramovich, she was the individual that did performance art, that basically said that you could use my body in any way that you want. And people came up and started literally touching her intimately and moving her around for 4 hours. One person even put a gun to her head, and the group actually rallied around to take it off. If you remember her Rhythm O project. We have Lalo Alcaraz, who is the Latino syndicated comic individual who really tried to do Muerto Mouse, challenging Disney that they were trying to kind of occupy his culture by trademarking his culture, and makes very insightful images in the Latin American community. We looked at Janine Antoni, who, as the response, who uses her hair as that response against abstract expressionism. That doesn't have to be all masculine. There's a feminine way of using your body in very powerful ways. We have the photographs of Diane Arbus, showing the individuals that are outside of society, whether they be individuals that are disenfranchised from the educational system, from the idea that they were born out of gender and LGBTQ question mark community. We had Yoon Bai, who actually turned to pornography to put herself through college, and then actually use the images, the very sexualized images of her own vagina, breasts, and sexual acts to make art that actually tries to help other girls get out of um, pornography that are there only for poverty. We saw the idea, we know all about the idea of Banksy, art literally in this graffiti kind of culture, but often with a political message. Jean-Michel Basquiat, the aftermath of kind of Keith Haring and Andy Warhol, pop art dealing with identity in the future. We'll look at his later on today. Louise Bourgeois, the idea of kind of a female sculptor and the power and the stipulations that she had to go through that we looked at. Of course, Brito here in Miami, Brazilian artists using pop art in very kind of kitschy, friendly, very easy ways, where we even talked about, is this really a high art form or more of kind of a children's art? Not to say that there's anything wrong with children's art, but is it really a high art form celebrating and pushing arts forward? We looked at the interactivity of Christo and Jean-Claude, and that is Christo, and specifically looking at kind of running fence and how the wind and how people come together to create great art forms. We looked at Chuck Close, and the Chuck Close is our large-scale photographs that we talked about, being one of the great portrait artists, particularly of himself. And then he even did the Bill Clinton presidential portrait, very close. And because he's got an eye condition, rather than just using tiny little kind of fractions, he uses little pixelated dots to actually kind of blend the colors together. We have Shepard Fairey, another pop artist in the modern day world. His Hope and Dream poster might have helped get Obama elected. We will look at Andy Goldsworthy, who is an environmental artist, later on today. The idea of the Guerrilla Girls, pushing the idea of feminism forward. Keith Haring, the invention of pop art and semiotics, where he came up with his own language of the way art works. Jean Quick to See Smith, the Native American, challenging the neoclassical belief that there's a patriotic world for all of us, including Native Americans, but that Native Americans need to create their own national cultural heritage and how they fit in with America. Donald Judd, a minimalist, doing minimalist sculptures and installations that really try to pare down art to its absolute essentials. We looked at the artwork of Jeff Koons and talked about, is he really one of the great artists in the modern day world? Or is he really just a great marketer within the process, similar to the way Salvador Dali was? Barbara Kruger, the graphic design feminist, to put in your face the idea of, with those red blocks and squares, puts the idea of feminism very much in the forefront and challenging gender roles in the modern day world. Yayoi Kusama, the idea of the Japanese pop artist who does installation pieces very much that brings you into an otherworldly, almost so anime feel out of Japan. Annie Leibovitz, one of the great portrait photographers who remarkably is able to get people to do something that and to open up with their own emotionality in the modern day world in a photographic kind of essay that we just don't see. We talked about the court case with Robert Mapplethorpe, his homoerotic black male bodies that he shows off. And were they really homoerotic, or is it just a man showing another man rather than a man actually showing a naked woman, which we generally have no problem with? There was a whole court case on whether it was indecency and considered pornography that we're showing. Melamede and Komar, the dissident artists out of the Soviet Union that came over here and basically started to challenge the idea of what patriotism means. Remember, they are the ones who actually Andy Warhol sold his soul in the One Soul Project. And later on, they're going to create America's Best and Worst Paintings, where they surveyed individuals and took the best ideas to where we end up getting George Washington in front of a beautiful landscape. Louise Nevelson, another woman like Louise Bourgeois, who actually challenges the notion of what it means to be a female artist, but just an artist, a sculptor, and was kind of locked out with issues specifically that come out of her father's infidelity and the protection of large-scale spiders and figures that are protecting children. Isamu Noguchi, a minimalist from Japan who creates these beautiful sculptures that are very interactive. Some of them even be like mantra slides that you can move on. He also creates the sunken garden in New York City, showing a garden environment and with water flows to kind of create the beautiful aspects of a city itself. Faith Ringgold, an African-American quilt maker and painter, challenging the notion of nationalism and particularly coming out of neoclassicism about um, nationalism not being celebrating July 4th, 1776 as the national pride for African Americans because they didn't get independence until later. Her most famous series, most likely besides the quilts, is the flag series, where she brutalizes that flag to show you how Native Americans have been brutalized by America in the term of talking about equality for all. Her famous flag, Die, the N-word that we looked at. Cindy Sherman, challenging gender roles in terms of feminism. We'll see her in our feminism lecture as well, challenging gender roles in the idea of the modern day world by basically recreating images of herself in stereotypical and dramatic ways, first as the victim and slowly as the powerful aspect that's very confrontational with a masculine, maybe even misogynist culture. Spencer Tunick, I don't think we've looked at him yet, but he uses human bodies like brushstrokes. So he invites thousands of people, and I'll show you a Tunick. He invites thousands of individuals to actually pose naked in different environments, trying to bring the world together in community, and then actually uses them as almost a decoration like you would like building blocks from a Legos. James Turrell is a light artist who, if you've seen the Kanye West video, or a number of Kanye West's videos, in fact, has this beautiful light, this Buddhist aura that comes in between the gradations of light. We'll look at his artwork as well. Richard Tuttle, a wonderful minimalist or post-minimalist artist, but one of my least favorite artists on this list, and maybe ever. Not because of the individual itself, just because the post-minimalism, it's been done so much that he is actually continuing on in that tradition. Remember, his most famous works are the wire sculptures, where he came into a gallery, unbent a wire, and in 15 minutes had $10,000 artwork. Bill Viola, who does rafts, or I'm sorry, who does videos, his most famous one of the raft that we saw, based upon Raft of the Medusa, show human experiences in a very slow-mo world, but using a digitized video format. It's one of our really famous video arts today. Kehinde Wiley, going off the tradition of Matisse with the various aspects of patterning and large-scale portraiture, also challenging the idea that African Americans shouldn't be in these large-scale portraits. And one of my heroes, Christoph Ladishko, who takes large-scale installation artwork to video projections and tries to solve a global issue, whether that's the Tijuana project about women being raped and abused that were beautiful in the NAFTA trade zone between Mexico and the United States. It was the talking box that he gave homeless individuals that needed help finding a job. This is kind of a range of what contemporary and postmodern art is. It's pretty exciting. So as I mentioned, let's go through a couple of these individuals, and then you can determine where you think the world is going, the art world, based upon those. So I don't think we've talked about these individuals before, but some of you may know this because these are one of the more famous contemporary artists, particularly because they did one in Miami. This is Christophe and Jean-Claude. They are married to one another, and they do environmental art. They do large-scale projects that brings individuals together, including having individuals working on the art side of it in terms of business. So they need to raise the funds for the particular projects. Oftentimes they need land grants. So for example, running fence in California ran for 26 miles. So they had to get the land rights and also work with farmers and raisers to make sure that the animals could get back and forth. They had to work with the environmental lobby to make sure any endangered species could go back and forth. In gates in New York City, you literally would walk through these beautiful gates during the winter and get a different view as you kind of turned around and saw this beautiful layout on the way the curves happen and the wind actually absorbs it in New York City. He has floating piers where you sign up and you go out actually on these floating piers and you float out for about an hour and then you get pulled back. And we wrapped the lovely images out here in off of Miami Beach. So that's another thing that was Jean-Claude and Christophe. It largely brings a large community together because he asks for massive amounts of just public support and help as he's doing these projects. One that did not make our list and should, she's fantastic, is Jenny Holzer. And what she does is she challenges power dynamics, gender dynamics, racial dynamics, specifically women most often. And basically what she's doing is she does large scale video installations all over the world. So our most famous one is probably Protect Me from What I Want. There's religion causes as many problems as it solves. And you can see, thou art thou kind of privileged woman who's really, really sure that nothing will ever. And so she has an entire range of these large scale video installations that she does. And sometimes they scroll through, as this one did in the Guggenheim. She's a pretty cool individual using kind of word art to try to explain the world and challenge the notion of the world that happens to be out there. Andy Goldsworthy, a spectacular individual who does environmental installation art. He sells photos then of the installation itself, and that becomes the art because his art is very ephemeral, meaning it does not last long. What's amazing is see that black circle? That is not video modified. That is just black dirt, but it's basically the contrast with the bright colors outside that make it look like a vacuous hole that goes on forever. It's not, it's regular dirt. And the same thing is here, these lighting conditions here. Note, it's that darkness that actually your eye naturally reads it as brighter, almost like it's glowing because you have a color gradation going out like this. Spectacular. Rocks that he found, made into a spiral or stacked. And so this is one of Yomari Silva, our sculpture professor's favorite artists because of the way he looks and consolidates and thinks about nature just as he's walking around in these beautiful landscapes. Here are other Andy Goldsworthy, and you can see some of them almost like Japanese writing here. I love this one. This tree had moss all over it. He just scratched the moss off in those particular areas in a matter of days and then took photos as if it's a Dr. Seuss tree. So spectacular, kind of beautiful ways. Here's the Faith Ringgold that I mentioned before, who we've seen during neoclassicism. The idea of challenging the dominant narrative that America is great and wonderful and national and all about democracy and freedom for everyone. And Faith says, hold on a minute, that's not true for us. And uses models such as Frederick Douglass, who basically wrote an essay that says, what to the slave is July 4th, basically saying that July 4th is not an African-American holiday. We were still slaves. And so we have an entire series of upraising and talking about when is African-American, and literally the American part of that, when is that nationalism? Is that in the aftermath of Lincoln? Is that in the aftermath of Jim Crow? Is that in the aftermath of the very racist policies of mandatory minimums in the 1980s? Is that police brutality? Has the African Americans even got to the idea where there is a national date yet, or are we still waiting for that today? And there are a fair number of African Americans leading that movement of what is nationalism in the African American community where we've been downtrodden for so long. Faith Ringgold is asking those questions. Kara Walker is asking those same questions. She's a brilliant Guggenheim fellow. She works out of Columbia at one of the Ivy Leagues and one of the best art schools in the country. And she basically does cutouts. There are these racist cutouts with overlays that are projections on the wall that you can actually see then, and whether they're individuals that are having children. So she uses very stereotypical 18th, 19th century images to challenge the Romantic South. And she was already a MacArthur Genius Award at 28. She's a brilliant artist. We also have to look at race and science fiction. If you don't know, science fiction is generally at the cutting edge of looking at societal issues. And so just to put in perspective that how science fiction is played in a couple notions from my sim class, Night of the Living Dead. If you don't know the original Night of the Living Dead, which was shocking and originally rated X because you saw a woman eating a piece of another human individual, not cannibalism, which is too much for them. Today we look at it and we're like, all right, PG-13 at worst, probably PG. So we've come a long way since the 1960s. But one of the things that shows up in The Night of the Living Dead, it's one of the first films, if not the first film, where the person who is the hero is an African American that protects a bunch of white people, particularly white women. And it was coming out in the time period of the civil rights movement. There was a social cause associated with it. We have the same thing going on with Planet of the Apes. Planet of the Apes basically asks the question that what happens if the apes, i.e. a racist terminology for black people, what happened if they were actually running the show and could talk and white people did not get the education and were the slaves? Would they be as awful to white people as white people were to black people during the 400 years of slavery? And that was a real question coming up in the 1960s. How different are we as humans? We have a neo-expressionist, as we talked about before. We saw him very briefly before, but the idea is you put a neo in front of everything, put empowerment, and using the basic elements of design, you've got yourself a post-impressionist or a postmodern. So he is mixed identity of Haitian, Puerto Rican, American. So American and Haitian. Jean-Michel Basquiat lives very short, 1960 to 88. He, like Keith Haring and many of the other urban street artists, died of AIDS very early on. So he dropped out of high school. He was unemployed, but he was living in the area of cultural milieu of early hip hop, and was around that time when art and music were going along together. In fact, if you don't know the basic premise of early hip hop had to involve a DJ who was mixing live music or recorded music that was added on top of that as the layer, and art. That was what hip hop was. And so he comes up with these things that are called suggestive dichotomies, where we have things that are wealth versus poverty, belonging versus segregation, really looking at his identity. And so if you look at some of them, you will note various different features that show up that are kind of simplistic drawings, and you're never quite sure, are they the representative of Jean-Michel Basquiat, of Basquiat himself, or are they about something else that's underlying just the African American community? So he's challenging the idea of identity and what it means to be poor versus rich, belonging versus segregation, African versus African American versus white within our modern day American society in New York in the 1980s. During this time period, of course, we're going to have the gay rights movement that really full-fledged starts off with the Stonewall riots in 1969. If you don't know, do a quick Google search to look at a 3 or 4 minute video. But we have cops basically storm in to Stonewall, which is a gay bar in New York, and did ridiculous amounts of damage, killing a few individuals for doing nothing wrong. I mean, really, it was against some of the laws that happened to be there, but they were really beefed up charges. And so the Stonewall really launched the gay rights movement, saying, we are being abused like other individuals. We need to start our movement. And then we came up with gay pride and the gay power parades that showed up in LGBTQQ, queer question mark communities. And one of the individuals that actually is trying to document this is Diane Arbus. She is by far one of the most influential 20th century artists. And she was fascinated by people who are visibly creating their own identities. This idea of identity is a very important part. Remember, because it's been white, male, heterosexual Christians that have made art. And now all of a sudden it's open to anyone. Anyone can be an artist from different fields with sufficient training, and they're often exploring identities. So the identities she's interested in are anyone. Cross-dressers, nudists, sideshow performers, tattooed men, the nouveau riche, movie star fans, individuals that have a disability. So one of her most famous artworks of all time is this one here. This is Boy with Hand Grenade. If you look at the boy, seems slightly off kilter, like there is something that's not quite right with him, and he's holding hand grenades, which begs the question: are they toys? Why hand grenades? Is he been brainwashed to do something? So it raises all sorts of different kind of interest in the modern day world, particularly for all walks and classes of life, which we just really haven't seen, right? Really, this takes realism, the idea of the poor and the disenfranchised, and looks at even those people that the realists did not make images about. We have our first openly gay artists that absolutely come out, and one of them is Keith Haring. He's basically following the model of Andy Warhol. Note the very short life that he lived, 58 to 90, so 32 years of age. And for Keith Haring, he very much was an advocate. So he was an openly gay New York graffiti artist, and he basically is the one who came up with semiotics, those symbols and those signs that create a new art language. TV for mass consumer culture, and whatever's on the TV would be important. The muscle coming up that's green with a dollar sign coming out for the capitalist power and how it can beat people up, right? Raise individuals up that are wealthy, but beat people up that are poor. The idea of men touching one another for the representation of homosexuality, and yet they're dead. Note the X's across their head already. Either that could be that society has actually killed them and not cared about them, or if there's a red X, it might be that they've actually died of AIDS or other various things, even violence that could have happened. Robert Mapplethorpe, which we looked at for the challenges, and asked the question, does sexual orientation matter when we use the human body as an art form? If a white heterosexual male Christian for thousands of years has been able to make artwork of prostitutes, let's face it, that's the definition of pornography. We saw it during the Renaissance, we saw it during realism. Can an openly gay individual, or even if he's not gay, can an openly gay individual make images of the nude male form? And the answer is today, yes. In Robert Mapplethorpe's day, no, because he was charged, as was the museum in Cincinnati that ran these particular ads, with indecency. And the question is, how are these any different than some of the nude images that we've seen throughout history, showing a woman, including her vagina and her breasts? And so this also came out of Cincinnati in the issue. If you give artists freedom of expression, soon every American will want it, which is a great slogan. That's exactly what we should want. And so if you're interested, I'll play you the quick video then that shows up. I don't know if I showed this to you before, but it's Mapplethorpe versus Cincinnati.
24-hour news channel.
And it led the news for weeks. You know, Jerry Springer, the Jerry Springer, used to be the host in Cincinnati, and he went on to his very illustrious career of filth and other things.
Good evening. The eyes of the nation are focused on Cincinnati tonight in what is one of the most important and controversial legal issues ever to face this town. The Contemporary Art Center and director Dennis Barry are charged with obscenity for 7 pictures in the Robert Mapplethorpe art exhibit. The trial started off with a bang, at least outside the courtroom it did. We'll begin with our team report with News 5's Jeff Hirsch, telling us about the vocal opponents who took center stage. Trial! Art on trial! Art on trial! Art on trial. That's what the 200 protesters outside the courthouse were saying, and they were saying art on trial is an outrage. No art, please! It's a farce. It's a farce. It's a fallacy. And we're here to try to stop that, and hopefully we can get something done and try to get Dennis Barry back in the society. CAC Director Barry and the Art Center itself were indicted over 7 pictures out of 175 in the Mapplethorpe show. 5 showed homoerotic and sadomasochistic behavior. 2 showed naked children. Protesters marched in front of the courthouse for 2 hours, then went into the middle of Main Street and stopped traffic, doing things deliberately designed to shock Middle America.
I love that sign, Censorship.
Decided not to make any arrests here, figuring any show of force would only make things worse.
Well, I think that was part of our concern, why we didn't send a team of police officers into the crowd. Again, our intent was to assist them in their demonstration with the least amount of disruption possible to the citizens of the city.
After blocking traffic in front of the courthouse, the demonstrators then walked down Main Street towards Fountain Square. They went to the square and to the Contemporary Art Center itself before heading back to the courthouse. I'm freezing to death, but inside my soul is burning. In 1990, we should not have to be standing here fighting for our rights. It should automatically be ours. Those rights, according to protesters, freedom of expression, artistic and sexual. In the conservative community, which is Cincinnati, the gay movement has not been particularly vocal politically in years gone by, but what happened here today is obvious proof that that is changing.
We feel that this issue is such a strong one that we had to make our presence here.
Jeff Hirsch, Channel 5.
And so we are looking at various, so here is the variation of a Mapplethorpe showing a nude image. But no, we've seen this with Courbet. That's from realism. This is from 1860. And here we're having problems all the way in 2000, 140 years ago, basically showing the exact same thing. So it does seem ridiculous. And the court does side actually with Mapplethorpe and the museum. The museum director gets his job back, but there's been so much damage that later on he gets a better job than actually the Cincinnati. So he becomes the first director of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So they sent him over because he was willing to stand up to censorship. And that's one of the things that Rock and Roll Hall of Fame really advocated for. And so we see these images. Now there is a warning here. We talked about Cindy Sherman with those great portraits, but in the aftermath of the Mapplethorpe also uses sexual dummies to kind of explore. And note, there's no protest about this because it's the female body. And so going back from 1860 with Courbet to the Jeff Koons talking about the pornographic imagery he makes with his own wife in the 1900s, which was also controversial, but didn't get people in jail. The Mapplethorpe and then the Cindy Shermans. And then also, of course, Yun Bai using her own, now remember, she is the Asian American artist, and her father dies when she is in art school. And so in order to make her way through art school, she actually sells her body in terms of prostitution, which is legal. And then later on, slightly regrets what she had done versus other ways. And so it goes back and uses her own body images from her pornographic shoots and from her friends' pornographic shoots, and actually makes artwork that's tiled and reference to Healing Joy Garden, or this one is Pussy Willow Garden that shows up, and then uses that proceeds to try to help women get out of the industry of pornography if they're there only because of poverty. An artist we have not talked about yet in terms of contemporary, so we're running through a bunch of different names so you have an activity later on what's going on, is Tim Hawkinson. Tim Hawkinson does body art. And so he does things dealing with the idea of using the body in a new way, not just to paint, but to move. And so the motor, he basically takes a self-portrait and divides it up into the faces and has a computer program so that you can go and you can play the Pew program and it's Tim Hawkinson's face saying, oh, I want Tim Hawkinson to be sad. And the computer program will manipulate the fractals and go, and Tim Hawkinson will be sad. Or I would like Tim Hawkinson to be happy. And the computer program, Tim Hawkinson is not happy. I would like Tim Hawkinson to be confused. So with the different emotions go, Tim Hawkinson is now confused. And maybe a tilt head. He also creates the idea of the handwriting machine. This is a machine that exactly reproduces his handwriting and his signature. We used to say that the signature is kind of the thing, the security check that other people couldn't emulate. And every one of them started to emulate it without a problem. So he says in the modern day world with all of our technology, there's nothing really unique about our signature. It can be easily reproduced, Xerox copied, manipulated. People can learn how to do it. And so he has a machine that does it. He creates these really cool, yet many people think gross, from his own toenail clippings. He creates these little tiny birds from his toenail clippings. And later on, he makes paintings of his own intestines based upon x-rays. And this is the wall chart of world history from the earliest times to today. And it's his intestines, his large and his small, that supposedly are like the world history and how we've evolved over time. So using his body in a new way to make art. Tim Hawkinson. We looked at him earlier when we talked about political cartooning, particularly in the aftermath of neoclassicism. The idea of, and Thomas Nast over here as well, the father of the American cartoon, basically invented both Santa Claus and the Democratic donkey. This is Lalo Alcaraz. He's the first nationally Latino syndicated artist in the world, and he actually does a cartoon actually called La Cucaracha out of the LA Times. And remember, he is the one that challenged Disney for the idea of trying to trademark Day of the Dead with Muerto Mouse, basically the Mickey Mouse or Disney's coming for your culture. And of course, Disney backed off because of the bad press they were getting. We have other individuals such as Native Americans. This is John Quincy Smith from 1940, challenging the U.S. national narrative on African or on Native Americans that freedom from 1776, clearly not theirs, because they took everything in a bloody math, and even in terms of the names of states and cities that are labeled out here in his states' names, tribal nations. And so we'll see things like Oklahoma comes from a Native American word, and Nebraska does as well. Here's the Russian immigrants, Melamede and Komar, that I had mentioned before. Creating and challenging a new neoclassical American artwork, especially how do immigrants fit in, and how does George Washington actually fit into the narrative of world culture, because here he is dominating Hitler and Stalin, which lived hundreds of years later. So did he create a giant American that's for the rights and freedoms of everyone, and that's what we've taken down? Because we have many of our own problems here with how we've treated Native Americans, African Americans, and women in our own culture. He also does the ones that actually create elephant art and buying and selling the souls. Here we have Bill Viola, and we watched his video on the raft, about the raft, which dealt with man versus nature. So we see that coming out in Japanese art, which is going to influence Impressionism, as well in The Raft by Bill Viola, just large-scale, slow-motion representations of the world around us. One of my heroes that I mentioned before, the large-scale video installations by contemporary protest artist Krzysztof Woliczko, and such things as trying to solve the problem of women being abused both sexually and in the business, sexual harassment, the Tijuana Project, trying to get the Brady Bill passed for getting assault rifle ban in the United States that eventually does get passed, and the Homeless Victims Project. William Kentridge, whose video we watched a little bit, who's a South American artist, a white South American artist, who's one of the first people to stand up and say apartheid is wrong. And so creates these beautiful drawing animations, large-scale video installations that generally have 3 levels. There's generally a background, and because they're painted and drawn, they move and pop very so slightly in the same color variation. There's generally a realistic drawing at somewhere in here, whether that's the outcropping or other individuals, and then an animation that shows up oftentimes on top of all of them. The ethics in art that we asked about, the performance artist Marina Abramovich's Rhythm O, it's the entire idea that she basically allowed other individuals to take use of her body. Her instructions were there are 72 objects on the table that one can use on me as desired. It's a performance. I am the object. During this period, I take full responsibility for 6 hours. So you'll note there's a gun, there's a cup, there's all sorts of things. And so she was violated sexually. And a group formed out when they really started to hurt her and put a gun towards her and pointed towards her head. Another group, after they had cut her already, right, and taken off, one had sucked actually blood off of her nipple. And that happened pretty early on. A group started to form around her to protect her from everyone else. And so as we think about this, one type of art that really does develop really in the postmodern world, maybe a little bit in the modern world, we go all the way back and we look at the performance art of kind of Cubist theater wasn't dominant, or in Dada theater from Café Voltaire, but really is a much more postmodern form of how you use your body in the world. So here's the case for performance art.
You're minding your own business in an art gallery when all of a sudden a movement occurs out of the corner of your eye. It couldn't be. You break into a cold sweat and look around for the nearest exit, but it's too late. It's happening. It's performance art. Why? Why has my precious fourth wall been violated? Why must I be forced to endure this inevitable awkwardness? This is the case for performance art. Performance art is a term used to describe art in which the body is the medium or live action is in some way involved. This is nothing new, of course. Human beings have always performed in front of each other through ritual, storytelling, dance, carnival, and on and on. But as art evolved, the word became known for describing specific things, mainly objects like painting, sculpture, and drawing. Live action belonged to other disciplines like theater and ballet and opera. But during the course of the 20th century, artists began to incorporate live action into works and describe it as art. The Italian futurists in the 19-teens saw performance as the only way to reach a mass audience, staging noise concerts and a kind of disruptive variety theater aimed at destroying, quote, the solemn, the sacred, the serious, and the sublime in art with a capital A. Think artists are kind of nuts? Well, the futurists wanted you to think that, arguing the name of madman with which it is attempted to gag all innovators, should be looked upon as a title of honor. Dada artists embraced the crazy as well, and built off the popularity of cabaret in post-World War I Germany. Artists Hugo Ball and Emmy Hennings opened Café Voltaire in 1916 in Zurich and invited artists and writers to come give musical performances and readings of all kinds. No one knew what might happen on any given night. It could be like this, or it could be like this. During the Weimar years, the Bauhaus was the first institution to offer a specific performance class, reinforcing it as a medium in its own right. Avant-garde theater flourished across Europe, and early surrealist Antonin Artaud theorized what he called the theater of cruelty, proposing a direct communication between the spectator and the spectacle, engulfing the spectator into the action, writing, "We abolish the stage and the auditorium and replace them by a single site without partition or barrier of any kind, which will become the theater of the action." After World War II, Black Mountain College in the US became a hotbed of experimental interdisciplinary practice, with avant-garde composer John Cage teaching classes and staging collaborative productions. They put on a version of Eric Satie's surreal The Ruse of Medusa, featuring Merce Cunningham as Mechanical Monkey, Buckminster Fuller as Nonsensical Baron, and sets by Willem and Elaine de Kooning. Cage shared with his students his understanding of music as it relates to Zen Buddhism, that art should not be separate from life, but an action within life, with all of the accidents and chaos and occasional beauty that entails. Participants in his productions were given loose scores that left a lot to interpretation, had unpredictable results, and were impossible to reproduce. Choreographer and dancer Merce Cunningham's revolutionary approach, also shared at Black Mountain, proposed that such ordinary movements as walking and standing could be considered dance. The boom of abstract expressionist painting in the 1950s emphasized the body's involvement in making art. It's obvious but easy to forget when you're looking at, say, a landscape, that every painting is a document of a series of actions that took place in the past. But with works like Jackson Pollock's, it becomes harder to ignore, with art critic Harold Rosenberg explaining the canvas began to appear to one American painter after another as an arena in which to act. What was to go on the canvas was not a picture, but an event. The Gutai group in Japan took these ideas a step further. In front of audiences, Kazuo Shiraga threw himself naked into a pile of wet mud. Saburo Murakami crashed through a row of paper screens. Tanaka Atsuko donned her electric dress. Back in Europe, Yves Klein embarked on a series for which he hired female models to cover themselves in paint and make imprints of their bodies on paper. Instead of walking through a room and glimpsing these things that happened in the past, here it is in the room with you, happening right now. The godfather of the happening, Alan Caprow, staged his first in 1959 at Rubin Gallery, stating on the invitation, "You will become part of the happenings. You will simultaneously experience them." Guests arrived with little idea of what would happen, both witness to and participant in loosely structured actions, left to make of it what they could. Caprow called it what he did because it was, quote, something spontaneous, something that just happens to happen. Artists associated with the Fluxus movement presented ordinary events as art, considering anyone and everyone to be an artist. At a 1962 Fluxus festival, Ben Patterson performed Variations for Contrabass, where he agitated its strings using a variety of unusual materials. Namjoon Paik dipped his necktie and head in paint and drew a line along a 13-foot roll of paper. Alison Knowles made a big salad and shared it. Much of it was playful, but for others it was dead serious. Joseph Beuys gave lectures and staged dramatic actions, enacting what he called social sculpture to try to change consciousness, believing art can and should transform your everyday life. In Vienna, a group of artists pursued what they called actionism, calling it not only a form of art, but above all, an existential attitude. Hermann Nietzsche enacted ancient rites, which he described as an aesthetic way of praying, and Valie Explore invited the public to reach into a curtain box to touch her unclothed body, a humorous but indicting action questioning the objectification of women's bodies. Performance came into its own in the turbulent 60s and 70s. The civil rights movement and second wave feminism underlined the fact that the body is political, and artists seized on its potential. Carolee Schneemann explained, in 1963, to use my body as an extension of my painting constructions was to challenge and threaten the psychic territorial power lines by which women were admitted to the art stud club. Through performance, female bodies and Black bodies and queer bodies and bodies that bring together multiple identities could be reclaimed, reasserted, and represented through many lenses, not just by white men this time, but by the actual persons in question. The minimalists were interested in phenomenology, or the study of consciousness from particular points of view, and so were performance artists. Inserting live bodies into artworks was an immediate way to unsettle the delusion that a universal perspective exists, insisting that every body is a self, inscribed by events, language, history, and identity, and is always in perpetual flux. These selves did lots of things. They became part of paintings. They wore paintings. They positioned themselves in space and in nature. They positioned others in space. They performed tasks, and they asked others to perform tasks. They made constructions specifically to hold their bodies. They followed strangers. They took on other identities. They asked questions. They created stores. They subjected themselves to danger. They tested their endurance. They turned the audience into the performer. They completely merged art and life. They explored desire, androgyny, sexuality, exoticism, and the burden of art historical representation. Since the 70s, performance art has been a relatively constant fixture in the world of art, used internationally to examine a wide range of issues. It's been documented and exhibited, but is largely resistant to commercial forces, offering artists a way to make work outside of the often oppressive market system. Performance today is so many different things. It's Caleb Lindsay singing as his alter ego, the melodramatic chanteuse Taiwan, whom he later declared dead. It's Aloran Casadias, Olympic gymnast, performing choreographed routines on wooden replicas of airline seats at the Venice Biennale. It's Ryan McNamara being taught to dance in public. It's Kate Gilmore's bright pink house with women in white dresses swinging from its windows. It's Bennett Miller's Dachshund UN. It's Ragnar Kjartansen's Bliss, a 12-hour performance of the last minutes of Mozart's The Marriage of Figaro over and over again. And it's still the classic stuff like Marina Abramovic's wildly popular The Artist is Present, where the audience was invited to queue up and eventually face off with the artist. It should come as no surprise when Jay-Z, inspired by Abramovic's work, called his music video a performance art film, arguing concerts are pretty much performance art with the venues changed. Performance art was born of interdisciplinary thinking and still thrives in those spaces in between. Think art's a scam masterminded by the rich and ridiculous? We'll still have a lot of artists who have used performance as a strategy to deliberately offend, upend tradition, and remake art from the inside. Performance art was born of a desire to flatten hierarchies inherent in traditional art forms, so that the artist could reach an audience directly rather than through coded forms or the separation of a canvas or frame. It wasn't so much that people wanted to make something called performance art, but more that these activities seeped out from other disciplines where they no longer quite fit in. As with any art, it's up to you to decide whether or not you think it's any good. But the way into performance is to allow yourself to be made uncomfortable by it, to admit your feelings of suspicion, fear, dislike, or claustrophobia. Performance art can give you room to think about who you are, where you are, and how you relate to those who are not you. It can allow us to contemplate the rules, written and unwritten, of any given space or place. Performance can make you uncomfortable because that's what it's supposed to do. It's designed to do. Don't leave the room. Stay. Be uncomfortable. Revel in the mystery of what may or may not occur. Think about why you're feeling the way you're feeling. Invite the discomfort. Invite the unknown. You and artists and art will be better for it.
And so performance art is one of the dominant ways that artists today, like Marina Abramovic, who's really kind of the founder of the movement for contemporary standards, with Rhythm O, where people could use her body, or just staring into the eyes of another individual for 2 to 5 minutes, which is what you saw her doing. Other artists like Spencer Tunick invites, again, another use of the body, invites people to pose nude, and they randomly come, they don't get paid, they get a photograph of the work that's done, but does large scale images where they just fill a space almost like the body is a brushstroke. Chuck Close does those close-up images. We've looked at his artwork as well, and we looked at portraiture of Rembrandt and what that means in the modern day world. And you can see his up close. He starts off with very photorealistic, where you really do feel like you get to know an individual that you are not near, because it's so large and overwhelming. And he did the portrait for President Clinton, which happily was his official portrait for the portrait gallery. We talked about portraits also with Annie Leibovitz, the idea of getting individuals and celebrities that we know well to be able to pose in what would appear to be very revealing ways. Yayoi Kusama's installations from Japanese pop, we looked at last time. And then, of course, we looked at Jeff Koons. And he's the greatest living artist in terms of being able to reproduce pop, this idea of neo-pop or post-pop that shows up, including sexually imagery, predicting what's going to happen, and his most famous are balloon dogs. The idea of Brito and what does it mean to be a neo-pop artist in the modern day world? Good guy, donated millions to save Brazilian rainforests and children's charities in Miami. But is this really what we think of as high art, even though it sells very well commercially? Because on some level, like pop art, it's easy to understand. It's just the stuff that's around us. decorated and more beautiful. We have another portrait artist, Candy Wiley, showing the future impact from Matisse on patterning, and his official portrait is President Obama, that hangs in the National Portrait Gallery. And note also challenging the notion of what it means to be Black and powerful. So here's Black Judith decapitating a white man from the series of Judith and Holofernes. We have neo-futurism. So you take the future machine aesthetic and that celebration, but you get rid of the politics about destruction. So you make highly reflective, beautiful pieces that are only possible with our modern computer technology. And then the question for you is this, and this is what I leave you with as you think through it. Which 5 postmodern artists do you believe will have the most significant impact on the future development of visual arts? You have seen a range of what almost all of these individuals do. I will also offer you the opportunity that if you would like to add someone in that we have either talked about in class or that you know of that you think are going to have that significant impact over these individuals, and you only get to choose 5. So in small groups, I'd like you to work, try to figure out, all right, who are the 5 that are going to push the bounds of where I see art heading? The more you know about art, the more you can predict on what's going to happen over the next 5, 10 to 15 years. And some of these individuals will absolutely have an impact on the future world. And I'm curious, which ones from your perspective, if I was to give you a job as a curator of a contemporary art museum, which 5 would you use your limited resources to bank on? Hopefully that if you got 4 or 5 or even 3 of them right, you would have a very significant modern art collection. That's the goal of a contemporary art museum. All right. I will pause while we do this. And then lastly, as we are getting close to the very end of the semester and the exam time, we want you to start thinking about the exam. Note your questions are all in your essential questions in your syllabus or your daily assignments. They're also at the very end of Blackboard. There's a chapter that says final examination, where all the potential questions are there. There are generally about 25 questions. They are short answer, I'm kind of bulleted out, where in many cases you'll have to come up with multiple lines of reasoning using visual evidence. So it's less about memorization and how well can you construct an argument based upon putting ideas together. That's the way the real world works. So you're going to review, the best way of doing this because you'll be doing it in class, is reviewing the time over graduate and allow long-term networks to be strengthened. The longer you start off beforehand, the better off you'll be. If you cram over a 3-day period, it will raise your test score by more than 25%. If you cram over a 5-day period and start studying 5 days out, it will go up to about 60%. And so they're overall just a 1-day cram where it goes in and then you lose the information the next day. Also, if you do that 6-day cram, it's actually learning the material. I highly recommend start off learning the material that you don't currently know and then move to stuff that you know better and better and better, rather than starting off with the stuff you know really well and tiring your brain out and just kind of running through things. You'll learn less that way. I hope that's a helpful study tip. You can use that in my class or any other class that shows up. And that is the end of our postmodern lecture. The only thing that we'll need to see from you in the future then is who are the 5 artists and what are the reasons behind why you think those 5 artists are so important in the contemporary world. And that is an interesting activity because each of you come with your own background and your perspective. That's why contemporary art museums generally have such different collections. They're all banking on the future. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Bye.